Hello, everyone, and what a pleasure it is to be with you again. My name is Nicky Dunne, and I'm delighted to have been asked back to appear again on Viking TV. If you tuned in last week, you'll have heard all about Heywood Hill, the small but powerhouse London bookshop that I'm lucky enough to help run. And last week I talked all about our work for Viking. Thanks to the incomparable Karina Hagen, we at Heywood Hill have meticulously assembled, as many of you will know, libraries for all of the Viking fleet, the ocean ships and the river ships. And it's been a really fascinating task for us, and we've enjoyed every minute of it. And it's meant that I've been lucky enough to get to know Viking as a company a little bit. And in my opinion, you can tell a great deal about a company from the way a company treats their suppliers. And we've worked with a great many companies of all different types over the years. And I can tell you that Viking sits right at the top of the tree. So I am extremely proud that Heywood Hill is one of Viking's cultural partners. Last week, I talked about our literary services that we've developed at the shop at Heywood Hill. And the libraries that we assemble, not just for Viking, but for individuals on every kind of subject all over the world. And of course, also our monthly book subscription, A Year in Books, that is so popular with readers of all ages, again, all over the world. I also said that the evolution of our business would not have been possible without the support and indeed involvement of the Devonshire family. And I'm delighted today that Stoker Devonshire, the current Duke of Devonshire, is going to be joining us from Chatsworth. And here he is. Welcome, Stoker, to Viking TV.
Thank you, Nicky, and good afternoon to everybody on the Viking TV slot. It's wonderful to join Nicky on this program. I'd be really interested to see, particularly to hear the questions that you have for us. But before that, we're probably going to do a little bit of talking ourselves.
That's right. Stoker's going to talk about his family and their extraordinary history over many centuries. A history that much more recently has become a little bit entwined with the story of the bookshop in Mayfair, Heywood Hill, that I mentioned. And yes, so we're going to hear from Stoker for a little while, and then we're going to look forward to answering your questions, which I'll be moderating. But for now, it's over to you, Stoker.
Thank you, Nicky. I wanted to show you, first of all, a photograph of the house I'm lucky enough to live in, where I'm sitting at the moment on this lovely sunny evening. This is Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. The square house in the middle was built around 1700. It took about 20 years. It was rebuilt on the site of an Elizabethan house built about 150 years earlier. And on the left, there is a wing with a tall tower at the end of it, which was built in the 19th century. And up above, against the skyline, you may be able to see it, a smallish tower. That's an Elizabethan building, which was built by the person who started the Cavendish dynasty, if you like, Bess of Hardwick. And she built that tower so she could watch the hounds hunting in the park below her after she became too old and infirm to follow them on horseback. So you've got three different dates there. You've got the Elizabethan tower, the 1700 square house, Palladian style of architecture, and the Victorian wing. And that is, as I say, where I'm lucky enough to live. My family have been here for the best part of 500 years, and things have changed a lot in some ways and very little in others. The next slide shows you where we are in England, for those of you who are not familiar already with Chatsworth. This is a map, and you can see Chatsworth in the blue, in the middle of England, really, about 60 miles east of Manchester, and about 150 miles northwest of London. Very easy train journey. It takes about 2 hours to get by train from London in normal circumstances. Obviously, these today in May in England are not normal circumstances, but it's a very easy day trip by train from London to Chatsworth. And so that is where we are, and that gives you an idea of how easy it is to become a visitor, which I hope many of you will. The square house that I showed you in the first slide was built, as I said, in about 1700. It started before then and finished in 1708. And it was built by the person who became the first Duke of Devonshire. He was made Duke of Devonshire as a thank you from William and Mary, King and Queen of England, because he was one of the influential figures who invited William and Mary to come over to England to take over the crown jointly from the Stuarts. And of course, the Duke, my ancestor, was incredibly proud of that ennoblement and his achievement. And he wanted everybody to know just how important and successful he was. So he built what really you should describe as a show-off house. The windows are gilded, the finials on them, the ornaments around the roof are gilded. He even put his name in 3 or 4 foot high gold letters along the front of the house so people could see that it was Cavendish, which is the family name of the Devonshires, Cavendish's house. And it was not unlike a very well-known American politician who puts his name on the top of his buildings for exactly the same reason. The gold is a sort of triumphant color, absolutely wonderful. I'm very, very keen on the bling that the first Duke put everywhere he could, and we have reinstated a good deal of that. So it was impressive from the outside, and I hope it still remains so. It was also pretty impressive on the inside, and this next slide shows you the first room that, if you've been a visitor in the early 18th century, this is the first room after the hallway that you would have come into. It is not all that originally called the Painted Hall, because that is exactly what it is. It is large, it's 2 stories high, and it is painted by the Frenchman Louis Laguerre with scenes of the life of Julius Caesar. And the idea was that any visitor who came to the house, and visitors were always welcome, because if you build a house to show off, you don't then tell people to go away, you welcome them with open arms. Any visitor coming to Chatsworth then, and perhaps even now, would have been quite impressed if this was the first room that they saw. Just next door to it is a different sort of space. It's the corridor leading down to the chapel, and there we are. It's become an accumulation. As I say, my family have lived here for a long time, and their possessions, some of them at least, have endured. And this passage has possessions accumulated by various different dukes over the centuries, and are now displayed in a sort of 17th century way. On the right, there is 2 Sekhmets from Egypt, about 1300 BC. On the left are various paintings, mostly 18th century English paintings. There are other antiques, Roman funerary urns and such like that. And it's difficult to see, but along the mantelpiece there is a site-specific installation by Edmund de Waal, a current living ceramic artist, and he made this in 2006. It's called a sounding line, and so that brings this space absolutely up to date. Something from almost every generation of my family are in there. And then if we just go upstairs, I'm not going to show you every room, but it'll give you a little bit of a flavour of the diversity of this rather wonderful, I think, wonderful house. Upstairs, in one of the staterooms, there's Amanda, my wife, and I, in one of the staterooms. The staterooms were built by the first Duke because he fondly hoped and expected even to entertain the King and Queen. And if he entertained the King and Queen, they would need to hold a court. And if they were going to hold a court, they'd have to have a suite of staterooms. So all along the south front, the south-facing front, there are 5 rooms in the best place in the whole house. Unfortunately, the King and Queen never did come and stay, so they've never been used for the purpose for which they were designed. And all they are good for, and it's not bad, but all they are good for is just walking through and looking at historic and some contemporary objects. So here's Amanda and I in this room with the Boule furniture from France, which was made for the first and the second Duke at the beginning of the 18th century. It came straight from the Boule studio and has been in this room ever since, which I think is now pretty unusual. The paintings of 17th century and early 18th century, and you will, I hope, notice the ceramics on both the tables each side of us. They're brand new for the last 5 years. They're made by an absolutely wonderful lady called Pippin Drysdale, an Australian, who's become a really good friend. So we have followed, perhaps slightly unconsciously, the tradition that most, not all members of my family have had of accumulating works of art in their own taste. Everything you see at Chatsworth was pretty well brand new when it first arrived. The paint was often wet on the pictures. People tend to think of it as all as old, and when we started putting new things, some people were a bit upset, but it's always been that way. Change has always been the keynote. And this next room is much more modern. It's halfway between the first Duke and the present time. This was built in 1833 for the Victorian Duke, who died in 1859. And this was built, this top-lit sculpture gallery was built by the architect Wyatville, Sir Geoffrey Wyatville, to house that Duke's collection of what was entirely, with one exception, entirely contemporary sculpture. The Duke started going to Rome in about 1819, 3 years before Canova died, and got to know Canova quite well. He commissioned Canova to make a large sculpture for him, which is the one on the right of the recumbent, the sleeping Endymion, and collected work by all sorts of other contemporary sculptors working in Rome at that time. Gibson for one, Thorwaldsen as well. The only non-contemporary to that Duke work is there is a bust of Alexander the Great, about halfway down on the right. You can't read it in this picture. And that is an antique. But the Duke said in his diary that by the time he got to Rome, all the really good antique marbles had found a new home, and there was very little available on the market. And so he stuck to contemporary stuff. And it must have been quite a shock for people visiting Chatsworth who hadn't been to Europe to see all this brand new stuff, shining white. It was as modern then as Damien Hirst is now, and perhaps as surprising as well. We haven't had a Damien Hirst exhibition in this space, but perhaps one day that's something we could do. We do have a wonderful statue of his, which he lent to us, which is in the chapel. And then I must show you, because this program is really about books and Heywood Hill, I must show you a photograph of the library. The library was made by the Victorian Duke. The ceiling comes from earlier times, from 1700, the ceilings painted by an Italian called Verrio, but all the walls are covered in books. There's about 15,000 volumes in there, and it is a really wonderful place to sit. We do add to the library, and I'm going to say something about my father's edition, one of them anyway, to the library a little later on. But as you can imagine, this is a really lovely place to be. We have meetings there. It's a good excuse to go there, and we often sit in there and just take a book from the shelf and have a read or a look at. There's lots of lovely illustrated books as well. So that is a combination of Victorian and very early 18th century architecture, all combined in one space. Now, in the library, as well as books, it represents really the archive, and I want to show you one of the earlier documents in the archive, which is a map a map made by a man called Senior, and it was made for Bess of Hardwick, who I mentioned earlier, who built the first big Elizabethan house on the site. And on the right is a close-up of the house and the garden. It wasn't really a garden, it was more of an orchard because everything had to be productive in those days. And you'll see some blue, which is the fish ponds. And on the left, a smaller scale map showing Chatsworth in relation to the surrounding parkland. So that's one of the very interesting documents. The rivers now follows a different course. It's one of the interesting documents that's in the archive, which is represented by the library. Excuse me. And then I can't resist sharing with you an image of Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher. Now, Hobbes is well known in the history of thinking, but he was also the tutor to Bess of Hardwick's grandson and her great-grandson, who were the second and third Earls of Devonshire, respectively. And part of his duties as tutor was to take them on the grand tour to Italy and Germany and France to see where the sort of center of European culture was and what was going on and what people were making and thinking and talking about. And he did that, and they had quite long journeys through Europe at that time as part of their education. I have to say that reading the accounts of Hobbes's tours on with these two different generations at two different times in his life, he allowed them, and dare I say it, almost encouraged them to behave really quite badly. There was a great deal of drinking, and I'm afraid a certain amount of brawling went on. Not good at all, but I suppose it was the equivalent of their gap year, and they managed to get a good deal into it as well as some proper education. So moving swiftly on, let's look at an illustrated manuscript, which I wanted to show you. It's a book of hours, or a prayer book, and it was from Henry VII, given to his daughter, Margaret Tudor, the Mary Queen, Margaret Queen of Scots, and then subsequently to her daughter, Lady Mary Douglas, and it came into the Chatsworth Library later. And it is signed by Henry VII with a message to Margaret. It was acquired in the 18th century by one of my other ancestors. This is the next is another a manuscript, not a manuscript. Well, it's a manuscript letter, and as you can see, the signature, which is at the top, is of Elizabeth I of England, and she has a wonderfully strong regal writing style. The letter was to Bess of Hardwick and her husband, Lord Shrewsbury, her fourth husband. And unfortunately, their marriage was not going well, and they were both very close to the Queen. And the Queen wrote this letter, which we have in the archive, saying to them, you really must behave better. You're setting a bad example and you're making me very unhappy, and will you please mend your ways and get back together again? Which they didn't really, but they did for a bit after the letter, because when the Queen told you to do something, you tended to do it. Otherwise, you could be in very serious, if not mortal danger. So that's an interesting document from the time of Elizabeth I. And then coming forward a bit to the 18th century, scientific, we have quite a good scientific library, because one of my ancestors was the scientist Henry Cavendish, who was a very advanced thinker. And in fact, he was the first person to calculate how to weigh the mass of the world, and a lot of other interesting discoveries that he made. He was a very, very shy man. He lived by himself. He hardly ever spoke. He was a member of the scientific societies of the day and went to their meetings, but he wouldn't engage at all in small talk. So he must have been hard work. But it's lovely to have his library, which includes not only scientific works, but a lot of illustrated books as well. One of the books that he collected was, I'm sorry, it wasn't. It was a later Duke who collected the Birds of America by John James Audubon. It's a huge book. It's called an elephant folio. And the reason for its great size is that Audubon persuaded his publishers that he must paint every bird in the United States life size. So here is this blue heron with its head turned to get into the page. But it's really a magnificent book, 4 enormous volumes. And because it's a book and it hasn't been cut up and hung on the wall, the images are in incredibly good, fresh condition, which is really lovely. Audubon completed this book he was in America it took him, I think, about 25 years to complete this study of the birds of America, and it is a really lovely thing. And of course, there are more than one copy, but fewer and fewer copies left in private hands. So coming now back to the connection perhaps with Heywood Hill and to more modern times, the next slide is a photograph of my father. As you can see, he's having a rest. He's sitting in the room where I'm talking to you from now. In those days, when he lived here at Chatsworth, it was what we would call his study, but he refused to call it his study because he said he never did any studying. It was his sitting room because he spent most of his time sitting. And here he is, photographed by Christopher Simon Sykes, resting on his sofa. All the newspapers. He was an avid news hound and loved politics, loved hearing what was going on. He had the radio on practically all the time. His political hero, Charles James Fox, in a bust, is keeping a careful eye on my father. And my father's surrounded by the paraphernalia of his life and the things that he loved. He made this library himself. He filled it with books. Most of them, I'm glad to say, bought from Heywood Hill. And there was always, in the hallway, there was always a parcel. When I was young and came here for the weekend and things, there always would be a big brown paper parcel with goodies from Heywood Hill waiting for my father to open it and to shelve the books. It's something he absolutely loved doing. So that's a really very evocative picture of my father in a place where he was very happy. And here is an illustration from this is the American cowslip, which has a curious habit in that when it's in flower, the flowers hang downwards. And when the seeds start forming, the flower heads turn upwards so that the seed doesn't fall to the ground before it's ripened. This is one illustration from Thornton's Temple of Flora. It's a really beautiful illustrated book. And my father bought this edition of it from Heywood Hill, as he bought, as I say, many, many, many of his books, everything from novels to history and illustrated books whenever he could. I'm not quite sure what first took him to Heywood Hill. It probably was my Aunt Nancy. Nancy Mitford was my mother's eldest sister. There she is on the left. She was 18 years older than my mother, but they were very close. And I became very close to Nancy. I spent a lot of time with her in Paris and in Venice when I was a student, which was a great privilege. Anyway, Nancy worked at Heywood Hill during the war and before she started writing books. And she started writing books because she needed the money. But she loved her time in Heywood Hill and made it a very popular place. Nicky will probably say something more about that later. But Nancy, got on very well with my father. And I'm sure that on the rare occasion that he was able to be on leave during the war, he would go to Heywood Hill, partly to see her and partly to buy books and to look at books. And here's a picture of my mother who my father wrote a couple of books. My mother wrote quite a lot of books. A wonderful book in the front there called The House. It's about 20 years old now, but it's still very good. And my mother and Nancy, as I say, were great friends. And my mother was a big supporter also, as well as my father, of Heywood Hill. Because my father spent so much time in Heywood Hill, and later after the war he bought a house, I think coincidentally, only two blocks away, and went there when he was in London, which was often. He went there just about every day. He loved the shop. And my mother enjoyed it very much as well. So they had a very close relationship with the shop. And after a time, the shop was in some sort of, not disastrously bad, but not good financial state. And John Samlett Smith, who was then the brilliant manager of Heywood Hill, John mentioned this to my father. My father was delighted to be able to help and bought a majority shareholding. That was quite a long time ago. It was one of the lovely things that I inherited on my father's death in 2004 was a majority shareholding. And so the family interest in this shop has continued. And in fact, it is in many ways stronger because I realized it was going to be very difficult to get the shop to work properly so that it could endure for a long time without becoming the sole owner. And so after a few years of part ownership, I made an offer to the other shareholders, which they accepted, and took over the shop myself. Fun enough, ironically, the very first job I ever had was working behind the counter in Hatchards. I won't tell you where that is because I want you to go to Heywood Hill on Curzon Street. But I've always had a love of book selling and books and bookshops. And so what a privilege to have ownership of Heywood Hill. And things got even better. After a few years, after John Samlett Smith had retired, Nicky, my son-in-law, he suggested to me that he would love to run it. And we needed somebody who was inspirational, dedicated, extremely clever, very good with people. And the nearest we could get to that was Nicky Dunne. And I must say, he has fulfilled every expectation. He's really led from the front, worked incredibly hard, and it's great fun doing business with him. I don't know whether there is a way of doing business with your family which works, but this seems, by luck and his great tact and good manners, to work very well. And we have a great deal of fun. He does all the hard work. I take any credit there might be for any success. And that seems like quite a good arrangement. But I know that what he's done for Viking is typical of the way he works. He makes a really good relationship with the client. He gets to know what they want, and then he delivers it. He doesn't deliver what he wants. He delivers what the client wants. And for all the things that he will tell you about that we do, that after the staff, the client are a very close second. The staff, of course, come first because they should in any business. But our clients are very, very important to us. So I think that's enough for me for the moment, probably more than enough for me. But I, of course, will help answer questions with Nicky, but I would like to hand back to him now for him to say a bit more about Heywood Hill. We can't hear Nicky. I can't hear him. So I wondered if there's something you can press, Nicky. He's clearly... There's a crackle, but a silence. I can't hear him anymore.
Is that better?
That's much better. Yeah.
I've taken off the headset, and hopefully you can hear me clearly wherever you are. And James, who's helping us with the technical side, can increase the volume. Stoker, thank you so much. That was so interesting, as always. And you was far too flattering about my involvement at the shop. It's been a complete privilege to be on the team at Heywood Hill since 2011, and it really is a team effort. There is a slide of the sum of the current team, which I just wanted to put on to the screen, because there are around 20 of us at the moment. As I said last week, we all share, we come from all over the world, all sorts of different nationalities, ages, sensibilities, but we all share a real passion for good writing and good books. And we all have our own individual passions, which we like to bore on about to each other and to our customers. But the thing we're trying to do is provide a personalized service, and I hope that I know that that's been appreciated by so many of the nice comments and the feedback that we get from Viking passengers. But I'm actually not going to talk for long. We're going to now look at the questions that you've been kindly sending in, and Stoker and I are going to share them. But I'm going to moderate. So I'm going to start off by asking you, Stoker. This is coming from Leslie, and she asks, I'm not sure where she is, but she asks, you have an amazing collection of art and sculpture, including some really interesting contemporary work. Have you added to the collection lately?
Well, I'm delighted with this question, because we do collect. Amanda and I have been collecting ever since we were married many years ago, partly because Amanda's parents collected pretty avant-garde stuff, and my parents collected, particularly my father. He was a very early supporter of Lucian Freud, for instance. So collecting has been in both our bloods. We have collected jointly and separately. Amanda, for instance, has built up quite a wonderful collection of jewellery by Andrew Gremer, who was a jeweller in London in the 60s and 70s. Now we buy many less paintings than we used to. We focus more on contemporary furniture and ceramics, and actually we've got, I think, a couple of slides showing recent acquisitions. One, a site-specific commission by an artist called Natasha Daintree, who is, like many artists who've done work for us at Chatsworth, has become quite a friend, which is lovely. I mentioned Pippin Drysdale earlier because we saw her work, but there should be a picture of Sewing Colour, which is, I think you better talk about this slide, and I'll come back to Natasha.
Well, I just wanted to pick up on the fact that as Stoker was talking, he was telling us about all the extraordinary characters and personalities that have led to Chatsworth's survival and indeed enhancement over the decades and centuries, and the real characters that from the first Duke onwards, in fact before the first Duke with Bess of Hardwick. Bess of Hardwick made me think, and indeed Elizabeth I made me think of this lady, who sadly is no longer with us, and she died last year, and her name is Linda No Lane. She was a marvellous character who would come into Heywood Hill twice a year in great state, like a galleon in under sail, with a huge turban, rings on every finger, a large cane in her hand, which it was a little alarming. And she would come and sit in the back room of Heywood Hill, and I would kind of sit at her knee and ask her and take dictation what she wanted to happen, and we would get on and do it. But she was a terrific character, and that's one of the real pleasures of working at a place like Heywood Hill. The extraordinary people that one gets to meet, from great characters, great customers like her, through to the book collectors around the world, the people who read, for whom reading is the most important thing in their lives, the writers, the publishers. We're really at a crossroads in Mayfair, and everyone comes to see us, and it's such a pleasure, and we really hope you will too. I just wanted to say about Linda, because her lawyer, after she died, told me, I confirmed that this story was true. She was a devout Catholic, and she went to see the Pope in Rome, in the Vatican, during John Paul II's pontificate, and typically she got in to see him, no problem at all, but she was so overcome by being in his presence that she fainted, and he had to catch her before she fell, which he duly did. So that's the sort of person we like to welcome to Heywood Hill. Lots of good stories about her. But no, now it's your. I think the next slide will show the ceramics, if you have them, James.
Yeah, here we are. This is a site-specific commission that we gave to Natasha Daintree, who is an artist whose work we've admired and acquired a little of in the past. And it took her about 3 years to make these pots. The idea is based on the Fibonacci formula. So they get bigger and bigger and fewer because there isn't space for enough. And they start tiny at the top, and then as per the formula, 1 and 1, and then 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3, and then 3 and 5, and so on. The pots at the bottom required her to invent the sort of technology to make it, the machinery. And what you have is, it's called sewing colour, and I think it's lovely. It's difficult with commissions because, you know, you ask an artist to make something and you have an idea what it might be. In this case, we said just make something, and we agreed on the space, and she made something. But often with a commission, you get what the artist thinks you want. That's a good result. Quite often you get what the artist wants for themselves. That's often a less good result. But in this case, I really do think we got not only what we wanted, but also what Natasha wanted. And it's a thing of great beauty. I showed you a little bit of Edmund de Waal's earlier site-specific installation of 2006. So this is 2018 or 19. And there was another one by Jacob van der Bergel, who did a much larger site-specific ceramic installation. So that's something which we've done quite a lot of. And the most recent acquisition, just to go back to the question, is this piece of furniture, which it just literally arrived this week. It's by Joris Larman, who works in Amsterdam. A lovely man. He and his wife have been to Chatsworth and had a look around. I hope that one day they will make a site-specific installation for a particular room. But in the meantime, I was able to acquire this bench. It's about 7 feet across. And it happened, when it landed, it arrived, it was unpacked and put in the painted hall. And of course, the patterns on Joris's bench match the floor very well. So we do continue to collect, and it is great fun. It's great fun getting to know the artists. It's great fun. I think a lot of our visitors relish it at Chatsworth when they see new things. Some say, oh no, we only really want to see the old things. But I think many more people increasingly like to see some new things as well. It makes it a bit lively.
Stoker, I'm just looking at the questions that we're getting in. There's a lot of questions from people wondering if the house is open to the public. Perhaps we weren't clear enough about that, but how would you respond to that?
Well, the short answer is yes, it is open to the public, but it isn't at the moment because of the pandemic. In fact, the house has been open ever since it was built. Tourism didn't really exist in the early 18th century, but tourism had taken off towards the end of the 19th century. And when the train came to the 3 mile away station in about 1880, and we had 80,000 visitors at Chatsworth over one weekend. So they had to have time tickets, and people waited in the garden. They'd walk from the station 3 miles and 3 miles back. That was a wet weekend, which was a sort of holiday weekend in this part of England. Normally we get about 600,000 visitors a year. We're open from about the 20th of March, typically, until the end of the first week in January when the schools go back after Christmas. And it is, we love it. It's great to have people coming round. The garden is open. There's 100 acres of garden. There's a farmyard and an adventure playground for the younger people. And of course, the house and we usually have a particular special exhibition every year. But it's all a little bit in limbo at the moment. We very much hope to open the gardens later this summer, and perhaps the house will see. It just depends on what we're allowed to do. But certainly, in the normal course of things, look on the website at www.chatsworth.org, and you will find exactly what's going on. There's plenty of places to stay. As I said, it's a couple of hours in a train from London, and the sun is shining now as it was shining when this photograph was taken.
Brilliant. It's a question for me, I think. Wendy Wren in London asks, how did Karl Marx's Das Kapital give you the idea for the subscription service? I think Wendy's referring to a comment that I unwisely gave somewhere else. And I should explain. So our subscription service, for those who weren't watching last week, and there will be a little film at the end of this evening's talk about it, is this important function, as we see it, of our bookshop. Our role is to keep readers all over the world to keep up to date with their reading and to help them develop and explore their through books. And we started this service about 9 years ago, and it's since gone extremely well, and we have customers in over 75 countries, all from our little shop in Mayfair. And that's because of the exceptionally talented team of booksellers that we have assembled. There are 6 of them who look after our subscribers. They each read at least 100 books a year, and they interview their subscribers, and then they think about them every month and send them a book every month. And there's a lot of interaction, or there's often a lot of interaction between the customer and and their booksellers. Essentially, you have a bookseller in your life for a year. And I don't often read Das Kapital, but I did happen to have in the shop a first edition, which, as many of you will know now, is a rather expensive book that retails for around £100,000, a little bit less. And we had a copy, and I was reading a little bit about the book, and Marx in Das Kapital talks about, he's talking about the sort of machine age, and he talks about, uses a phrase that machines can't provide the conscious linkages that human beings can. And it was a phrase that stuck with me, conscious linkages. And this is exactly what we do in the shop. We think about someone, we think about their taste, what they read last, and they might want something completely different. So the linkage may take one off on a tangent, but there's always there's a reason why we've chosen a book for someone, and that's the very special service that we provide. Now, next question. What's your favourite travel book? That's from Leonie in London. Do you want to have a go at that, Stoker?
Well, at the moment, travel books are the only travelling one can do, and so they're a pretty important part of one's sort of literary resource. I hardly ever read a travel book I haven't enjoyed, but I think that partly because he was a friend, but the books that Paddy Lee Farmer wrote about, particularly about Greece and about travelling generally, they're very much part of my sort of memories and time spent with Paddy. And he used to come and stay here at Chatsworth. He was a great friend of my parents. My father went on a mountaineering expedition to the Andes with him, and Paddy wrote a book called 3 Letters from the Andes, I think it's called that, which is quite a small book, but it's lovely. And obviously I was very interested to read it because a lot of it was about my father. And Paddy was the most charming companion, was one of the nicest, most friendly, sort of frightening, but brilliantly clever people I've ever met. So I really loved reading his books. What about you, Nicky?
Well, Paddy would be right up there, and as you know, was a great supporter of the shop as well. And in fact, as I said last week, opened an account for his Romanian lover, the princess, was to make sure that after the Iron Curtain fell, we could try and get good books to her. And he actually lived above the shop for a few weeks in the 30s, and headed off on his great walk across Europe from across the street. And in fact, also had lodgings in Shepherd Market in a brothel for a while. Well, I probably shouldn't talk about that. But for me, I think Norman Lewis is the travel writer who I particularly enjoy reading, and anything that he wrote was non-fiction was it resonates with me, and he wrote a wonderful book about Burma called Golden Earth that I adore. So I take Norman Lewis with me every time. Do you have a favorite bookshop in America? Well, I could go first. I would have to say that I love some of the antiquarian book dealers in America, and in New York in particular. Don Heald springs to mind, and James Cummins too. Well worth a visit. But also the great Charles Myers, the publisher at Rizzoli. Charles has sustained physical book selling in Manhattan with the wonderful Rizzoli store, which is in Midtown. And then further south is a store I absolutely love going to, which is Three Lives, which is rather similar in a way to Heywood Hill, and it's a special place. And of course, the Strand is a must visit. There's so many still in New York, I'm pleased to say. We have someone's asking from Boynton Beach. Jerry is in the United States, is asking, has Amazon hurt our sales? Well, it's fair to say that booksellers have a rather ambivalent opinion of Amazon and its influence over the last 10 or 15 years. But in a sense, it has woken us all up and forced us to make bookshops, physical bookshops, more inviting and better places for people to visit. So, or to indeed to innovate in terms of the services that we offer. And Amazon itself has been has developed some interesting book selling capabilities. But for us, we're very lucky with our customers. Our sales have been rising consistently over the last 10 years. But I think we're rather unusual because so many booksellers that I know have been forced to out of business, and I'm not attributing that directly to Amazon, but it's not an easy environment, and it certainly hasn't been in the digital age. Next question: how often do you think people reread books? That's from Margaret in Puerto Rico. Well, I think it all depends on the person. I don't reread books really at all, apart from one or two favorites. But I certainly know people who constantly have a cycle of books that they go back to year in, year out. So I think it all depends on the person. Apart from English, what prominent languages do we have in the shop? Well, we're an English bookseller, and we're a sort of quintessentially English bookshop, and so all our books generally are in English, apart from the many rare books that we have in other languages, or may have in other languages. So we certainly sell rare books in every language that one can think of. And we were lucky enough to have some early Russian books recently, and some interesting Islamic books. So we will stock any interesting book if it catches our eye. What else have we got here? Let me look up some questions before. I hope Stoker will rejoin us. Someone's asking me, Mike in California, did I have an early interest in reading as a child? Well, I'm ashamed to say I didn't really. At least I don't remember having one. I came to books and to book selling to scratch an itch, really. out of a sense of intellectual dishonesty and inadequacy, I only discovered the world of books and reading at university. So I came to it pretty late, and that's why when I meet parents who have children who are not that interested in reading, I tell them not to despair, because I'm sure in time everyone comes to books and to appreciate the pleasures that they provide. Sarah in Atlanta is asking if Chatsworth has been used for film as a location.
We had a spurt of films. There was a film called The Duchess with Keira Knightley, which was about the wife of the 5th Duke, Georgiana Duchess. She was quite an amazing person, quite a serious person, but she was tended to be portrayed as a sort of celebrity fashion it person. But she was more than that. She wrote a book. She wrote quite a lot of poetry. She was very knowledgeable about minerals. Anyway, Amanda Foreman wrote a biography of Georgiana, and that was made into a movie called The Duchess. Quite a lot of that, of the exteriors, was here at Chatsworth. And there's been one or two other very popular films here. We haven't had a film made for the last 2 or 3 years, but we're always discussing opportunities for filming with film companies, and sometimes 2 or 3 happen together and then not for a while, but I'm sure there will be more in the not too distant.
Let me just see what else we've got here. Someone asking who are some of the famous people who have visited Chatsworth. Well, that is a long list.
Yes, well, my parents, well, it depends how far you want to go back, but my parents had a lot of artist friends, as we do. I mentioned Lucian Freud earlier, and a lot of writers. Aubrey Moore was, Evelyn Moore rather, was a friend of theirs, and Cyril Connolly. And of course, the Mitford sisters came here, not all together because their politics were so far apart that wouldn't have been very enjoyable. They went from the extreme left to the extreme right. And I must say my father was fantastically loyal to his wife's family, and invited them all to stay in their turn, as it were. And so there was a lot of that going on, and we do have some friends in that world. We have a lot of gardener friends. Tom Stuart Smith and Dan Pearson, two quite well-known English garden designers, are both working here at the moment. So when they're working with their designs in the garden, they usually stay with us for 2 or 3 nights, which is a great pleasure. So my parents had a lot of political friends. My great uncle, Harold Macmillan, was Prime Minister for a while, and he was married to my great aunt, and he stayed here, particularly as an old man after his wife had died. He stayed here a good deal, and he spent a lot of time with my parents. He was very fond of my father, and vice versa. And my father had a lot of other political friends. When there was a whole plane load of them came back from President Kennedy's funeral, and the plane had to be diverted to Manchester from London, and it was arriving quite late in the evening. And so my parents were able to say, oh, don't worry, you can all come to Chatsworth, which I think gave the housekeeper a bit of a fright, because she only had about an hour and a half notice of 12 guests, including Alec Douglas Hume and various other luminaries of both sides of the political divide. With my father's idea of absolute heaven, to have a house full of politicians at short notice, or long notice for that matter.
There's a question here for me, I think. Well, not really a question, but last week from Carol in Oregon. She was in London and paid a pilgrimage to the Charing Cross Road. I told the story last week of the rather romantic marriage proposal that took place in our shop a few years ago. Anyway, Carol went to 84 Charing Cross road, or at least to find it. And all she could find was a McDonald's, and she wished she knew about our shop then. So Carol, do come back and look for us. We're on Curzon Street at number 10. Someone's asking, in our opinion, who is the American writer that was most equivalent to either Charles Dickens or P.G. Wodehouse? Well, that's a tricky one. I would have to put Mark Twain on that list, and Henry James. But for me, the finest American writer in the second half of the 20th century would be John Updike, who I'm devoted to, and think that he very few get close to him in terms of his range and ability. Jerry from West Palm Beach, we bibliophiles sometimes have unusual subject matter that we collect. That's certainly true. What are some of the most esoteric subjects that you source for your clients? Well, we have created libraries on all sorts of subjects, and some can be quite niche, shall we say. One of which somebody asked for a good shelf of books on the subject of dragonflies. And dragonflies are, I discover, odonata, and there is a academic field devoted to them, but of course none of us knew anything about them, so we had to do a lot of research, and the research led us, and often when we're researching subjects for libraries, we end up talking to academics in a particular field. And in that case, we found two academics that were hosting into academic forum for that subject. And we contacted them both. One was in London at the Natural History Museum. He wasn't very helpful. But I'm pleased to say another was in Birmingham, Alabama, and he was incredibly helpful and ended up providing us with some fascinating information. And we were able to find a really good selection of books on this extraordinary subject. So I think dragonflies was one of the most unusual that we've been asked to stock. What part of working for Heywood Hill do I find most satisfying? Are you considering expanding business into new locations? That was Valerie in California. Well, we're not thinking of expanding. We like the idea and have managed to, as I said last week, intensify the sort of mass, increase the mass of our little shop. And despite its small size, we think it attracts people from across the world, and that's partly because we are only one shop. So we don't want to expand it physically. And the most satisfying thing is undoubtedly the people like Linda Nolane, and all sorts of people in all sorts of countries, from the very grand to the very humble, often interchangeably. There's always a surprise. We had some builders next door to us the other day, and the scaffolders were taking the scaffolding down in a rather dangerous fashion. So I complained to one of the builders who I got to know, who was an Irish man, of diminutive stature, and we were standing outside Heywood Hill after he told off the scaffolders, and he looked in the window and he said, "Oh, I see you've got the graphic novel of Proust in the shop." And I said, "Yeah, I do. Do you read Proust?" And he said, "Yes, but only in the French." And it was a good moment, because I couldn't possibly attempt Proust in the French. But it's the great democracy of reading. Everyone reads, and you never know who's going to have what kind of taste. So I particularly enjoy that kind of moment. Now, what else have we got here? Let's see if we have some new questions. Someone's asking if most of the books we carry are written by British authors. Well, a lot of them are, but not exclusively. And do you have buyers around the world that look for rare books? Absolutely. We were selling books today in America and in Europe. There's a message from a friend of mine. Are there schemes to distribute used books to the less fortunate? Well, we don't operate many. The only thing that we do is we receive a lot of proofs from publishers, and we do send those to a charity bookshop. There are some very good book charities. I think Book Aid is one that sends books to those who aren't able to afford to buy books. We have one wonderful customer who is very generous with who he sends books to, and he's adapted our subscription service. There's an unfortunate man, but a nice man, who is homeless near our shop in Mayfair, and he has a very distinctive way of attracting interest when people are walking past him. Instead of saying, "Can you spare me £1?" he says, "Can you spare me £20,000?" which certainly gets one's attention. Anyway, this charming customer of ours who lives locally has set up an account for him, and he's allowed to come in and buy. Well, he's allowed to come in anytime, but he will be supplied with a book once a week, and it's often he's often one of the earliest customers into the shop every Monday. In starting a private library, can you recommend a few good starter books? That's from Cindy in California. Well, it all depends on what your interests are and what you want to do with your sanctuary, your library space. And I think the way to start is obviously to pursue your own interests and pursue the authors and subjects that you particularly like. And we can certainly help with that. Often people have a kernel of books on a particular subject that they have in their homes, and what we like to do is see what someone has and then really amplify that with books that relate to that subject, and we're doing that at the moment for someone in Washington State who's developing a library around Irish poetry and English poetry, starting with the current generation of poets, and our job is to find links, some conscious linkages again, that go back through the history of Irish and English letters. And that's really interesting project. We're also starting a project for someone who wants a library of biography of people who have changed the world, people who have disrupted the world, disrupted markets, disrupted economics, disrupted the political world. So that's a really interesting project, very research-led, as most of our projects are. Now, what about for you, Stoker? Someone's saying, how many of those books has the Duke read? I mean, I always think that's a tempting question when you see someone in a library, but as I've only read a small proportion of my own books, I always rather shy away from that question. Anything you'd like to say on that, Stoker?
Well, it's a strange thing that people who love buying books don't always read what they buy, but I believe that there are people who buy clothes and never wear them, so that's just as odd to my way of thinking. I certainly haven't read all the books in this room or in the library upstairs, and nor will I, partly because a lot of them are in languages which I don't understand, partly because some of them are on subjects which I'm not interested in, and partly because I haven't got time. But it is a great privilege, a great pleasure, and a great luxury to go and find a book you need, because you know more or less where stuff is, where the books are. If you get asked something or something comes up in conversation, I know that Google is effective, but it's not nearly as interesting as reading from a reference book, which is absolutely authoritative, which Google inevitably can't be. So to be able to go to a book and find out a fact or compare what one person's view in one book of an event with somebody else's view in another book of the same event, that is sort of, to me, the idea of heaven, really.
A number of questions from people who know of streets or districts, particularly in America, with either the name Devonshire or Chatsworth in it, and someone is specifically asking, what is the significance of the name Devonshire?
Well, it's difficult to explain. I'll explain. When Bess's son decided that he needed a title to reflect his position in society as he saw it. He went to the authorities in Whitehall and acquired an earldom for £10,000, which was a great deal of money in those days. And that was a perfectly well understood procedure. That was the price for an earldom in 1620 or whenever. And so he went to, I imagine, the College of Heralds, and they said, well, you can't have Derby because there's already an Earl of Derby, as indeed there still is. Although the Earl of Derby actually lives near Liverpool. It's very few people's titles reflect where they live, and that's always been the case. So he said, the man in the College of Heralds said, well, there is the earldom of Devon, the earldom of Devonshire has become vacant, and so you can have that. And unfortunately, my very distant relative didn't have the sense to realize what a confusion that would cause in the 20th century and probably before. So he accepted the earldom of Devonshire. When my family were promoted from earls to dukes in 1694, we stuck with the same name. And it is very confusing because we have absolutely no connection with the county, which is actually not called Devonshire either. It's called Devon. And so it's a sort of make-believe place. Chatsworth, on the other hand, is the geographical name of this house and where it sits. It's called Chatsworth House. It's sometimes called Chatsworth. There are people who live here as well as us, not at the moment in the house, but there have been a number of flats in the past. And in the stables behind the house, there is still one family living there. So Chatsworth is really an easier identification. And I imagine that the names of Devonshire came probably from sailors. We never had any property in the United States, sadly. We had investments in the Virginia Company, but not of a sort to justify anything being named after us.
Someone's asking, what is a favourite book that you recommend about travel in England? Well, I think if you have never been to England, then perhaps why not Bill Bryson's Notes on a Small Island? But if you want something a little bit more in depth, then you probably need quite a few books. And Simon Sharma's, I think it's a 3-volume Complete History of Britain is extremely readable and very, very good. And then, of course, to counterbalance that, you need some literature. And there are some very obvious people to have on that list, starting with Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, which, as Stoker was saying, was the film of which was filmed at Chatsworth, and Chatsworth is one of many houses that are thought to have been the model for Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice. But Austen, you'd want Dickens, you'd want some P.G. Wodehouse, and I think you'd certainly want some Thomas Hardy to get a flavour of 19th century England, and then something more contemporary, perhaps a combination of Martin Amis's London Fields and Zadie Smith's White Teeth. And I think those sort of six authors would give you a real sense of England over the last, or Britain over the last 100 years or so, or 150 years. We were asked by we created a library in a foreign in an embassy in London, of an Arab country's embassy in London, and the brief there was to create a library that if you took someone from that country and they put them in a room for 3 years and they had to completely understand Britain, what books would be in that room. And so we built a library around that theme that was very satisfying. What were you going to say, Stoker?
I was going to say that I think it would be a pity to omit Pesner's, which is architectural history, county by county guide. Because particularly the new edition, which is coming out sort of one volume at a time, I think, isn't that right?
It's still Yale are republishing it, yeah.
And it really does give you a feel for the smaller buildings, not just the grand buildings, but the smaller buildings in the villages and the towns all over the place. And it's a book to have in your car if you're driving around the country. But you need several volumes if you're going to more than one county, obviously.
Quite a few people are asking if the library at Chatsworth has been catalogued and if it has been digitally catalogued.
It hasn't been digitally catalogued. There is a plan to do that. It would be wonderful. There is a manuscript catalogue, but it's not that accurate. It's pretty accurate, but it's not accurate enough. And there have been some sales in the 80s of books. Unfortunately, the books that were sold weren't listed by the auctioneer, which was a great pity. But we more or less know what the gaps are. But I hope in my lifetime we would have a digital version of the catalogue of the libraries. I would find it absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of other people would as well.
A number of people are asking, and I think we'll bring this to an end shortly, but a number of people are asking what books I would recommend for now, for the lockdown. And I asked my team this question earlier, and a number of them made the same distinction. I think it depends if people want either total distraction from what's going on, or rather to lean into the situation, as one of our great booksellers, Faye Keegan, mentioned to me. If the latter, leaning in, she recommends Emily St. John Mandel's novel Station 11, which I haven't read, but it's about a global pandemic that causes a total breakdown of all civilized society, which hopefully isn't going to happen. But in its aftermath, a group of misfit actors travel from settlement to settlement, performing Shakespeare, largely from memory. She says it's extremely thought-provoking and with a good mystery at its core. But I think the classics are the alternative. Nice long books too, so I think those are the two ways to go. There's another great dystopian novel, The Stand, another apocalyptic book by Stephen King, which I think one of my team is reading. But now let's see. I think we're probably there. A lot of people are asking if there's one book, the sort of desert island choice. Stoker, if you had, are you able to think of something that you would if you had to name one book?
Well, I think I have given it a little bit of thought. It obviously slightly depends where the desert island is, but I think that for me, I would take the Royal Horticultural Society's 5-volume dictionary of gardening, horticultural dictionary. I would hope that some of those plants would be growing on the island, or that I might have a secret stash of seeds. What about you?
Well, I think I would take Proust. I mean, there it is. It's very pretentious, but people talking about books is a little bit fraught with one of your words, hubris. But I would certainly take that incredible book that Updike so memorably described as so simply as a vast, sweet sea. So you can't really do better than that. And Stoker, finally, just a question from someone. Did you ever meet Kit Kennedy?
No. I was 4 when she was killed, and I never met her, sadly. I would love to have met her. My recently deceased aunt, Elizabeth, knew her very, very well. My parents obviously knew her pretty well. And everybody you speak to her about Kit absolutely loved her. She must have been a magnetic and lovely person, and the whole tragedy of my uncle's death in the war and then her death in the airplane crash in '48, just what a waste of those two wonderful people.
Well, I think that we've actually been live streaming now for 75 minutes, and I think we've gone way over the length, and that's thanks to you all for contributing so many questions. We've only got to a small amount of them, but on behalf of Heywood Hill, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Stoker for being such an articulate spokesman for Chatsworth, but also for Heywood Hill. We will sign off with huge thanks to Viking, who have kindly made a little film about our subscription service, which I think is only 2 minutes long. And I think we're going to play out with that. So from us here in the UK, wherever you are around the world watching this, thanks for tuning in, and do come and see us in London or at Chatsworth, where you'll find Stoker. And if you come to London, you'll find me at Heywood Hill, where you'll be incredibly welcome. So it's goodbye from us.
Bye.
The ships of Viking sail with the most sophisticated, thought-provoking libraries on the water. They're curated by Heywood Hill, a tiny shop in London that just happens to take care of the Queen's book needs too. And for the rest of us, Heywood Hill also offers a yearly subscription plan that delivers a good read chosen just for you every month.
The essence of this business is good writing and our shared love of good writing. And there are 16 of us here, and we all have the passion for good books. The heart of what we do here is recommending books individually. And we thought, well, why not open that service to people who can't come into the shop? And so we set up a very bespoke subscription service where one of our expert booksellers has a conversation, hopefully in person, but perhaps over the telephone or even online, to find out what your taste in reading really is and where you are in your reading. And that begins a fabulous relationship with our shop. I'm pleased to say that that service has really taken off and is happening all over the world. Our subscriptions team read at least 500 titles a year between them. It's an extraordinary thing. My team spends all day thinking about individual customers and what they should read next, what they might like to read the following month.
Heywood Hill is a very special place, filled with intriguing books and inspiring people. I hope you'll do as I did and check out their subscription service for yourself. Or perhaps give it as a gift to someone special.